Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, those here in person, those joining online. It really is a privilege to host this discussion this morning, exploring Gulf investment in green economic growth across Sub-Saharan Africa. My name is Alex Benkenstein. I head the Climate and Natural Resources Program at the South African Institute of International Affairs. I think most of us are familiar with our institute, SAIA, but for the few who perhaps are new to SAIA, we are a leading African think tank advancing evidence-based policy and dialogue across the continent. We do work, of course, on South African policy priorities, but much of our work also looks at African continental priorities and engagement, including Africa in the world. We have been very involved in discussions around addressing energy, just energy transition, addressing the challenges that the continent faces in terms of climate change and climate response. And we also frame that work often in the context of, as I said, Africa in the world and specific geographic or block dimensions of that. So looking at the role and implications of the G20, of course, with South Africa's G20 presidency this year, having particular priority, BRICS, EU Africa, China Africa. And so this discussion, looking at Gulf engagement in Africa, sits very naturally with SAIA's engagement on this issue. And we're very excited to be working with Mehran and his team at the Bourse and Bazaar Foundation as part of the broader Rihla initiative. We recently, earlier this month, at the Africa Climate Summit, hosted with the AU, the Africa Climate Innovation Hub, where we brought together over 70 young, dynamic climate innovators from across the continent. And I think the key insight that came from that is that we have a young continent, a creative, entrepreneurial continent, and there's a vast amount of innovation. There's abundance of ideas around how to deal with a continent's pressing developmental, environmental, climate challenges, and also to reframe these challenges as opportunities. We know that Africa is rich in human capital, rich in natural capital, and also extremely rich in terms of renewable energy resources. The continent has close to 40% of the world's renewable energy potential, yet only a minuscule share of actual installed generation capacity, less than 4%. So clearly there are huge opportunities across the continent. But undeniably, one of the challenges in taking advantage of this entrepreneurial spirit, this innovation, there's a technological component to that. There's also financial capital component to that. And so partnerships are going to be key to developing this potential in an effective way. And Gulf Africa cooperation in that context then becomes very important to explore. I want to say a huge thank you to the Embassy of the United Arab Emirates here in South Africa for helping us host this event. His Excellency Mahashaid Al-Hamdi, the ambassador of the UAE to South Africa, is not able to join us today. As many of you know, G20 involves a lot of obligations, and that has kept us from joining today. We're very fortunate for the embassy to be presented here by Councillor Fatima Al-Suwaidi. But we did have very constructive discussions ahead of this event with the ambassador, and it was very encouraging to receive that support, and we look forward to advancing that engagement further as well. I am not going to spend too much time on these introductory remarks. We have a fantastic program this morning that'll take us through to lunch. At this stage, I want to hand over to Mehran Hajirugan, the Director of the Rihla Initiative for Green Economic Growth.
Thank you, Alex. On behalf of the Bursa Bazaar Foundation and the Rihla Initiative for Green Economic Growth, I'm very pleased to be here in Pretoria, South Africa for the third edition of the Rihla Initiative panel series. We're truly excited to be partnering here with SAIA, our institutional partner for Sub-Saharan Africa for the policy phase. Many thanks to Alex and Jordan for organizing this panel with us. We're also privileged to have the support of the UAE Embassy in South Africa. Thank you, Your Excellency, for joining us. And to all of you here with us today in Pretoria, as well as those joining us online, thank you for being part of this conversation. I would like to take this opportunity to briefly share some background about the Rihla Initiative. The Rihla Initiative for Green Economic Growth is a project dedicated to understanding and expanding Gulf climate finance and economic development in the global South. The initiative was established in recognition of the fact that the GCC states, particularly the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, are already investing billions of dollars in countries near and far in the pursuit of a green transition. Our main objective in this first phase is to analyze and present the policy frameworks needed to ensure that these investments contribute not only to a green transition, but also a just transition. At the same time, our work looks at how these investments support the economic diversification efforts of the GCC states themselves. Rihla focusing on four key regions, the Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, South and Southeast Asia, and Central Asia and the Caucasus. Today, the initiative includes 18 members. We have established a policy council bringing together leading voices on climate, finance, and sustainable development, as well as an implementation council composed of experienced practitioners. Each region is represented by 8 members in the policy council, and we have a 12-member Gulf committee made up of GCC nationals and Gulf-based experts. I'm very grateful to Cynthia and Kodakawashi for taking part in today's panel for the policy council, as well as Hamza Sheikh from the Gulf committee. Over the past 6 months, we have convened a range of closed-door meetings, workshops, and simulation exercises with our council members for each region, covering topics such as renewable energy, industrialization, infrastructure, water, and agriculture, among others. We have formed cross-regional and cross-council focus groups to provide deeper analysis on specific sectors, including the blue economy, green urban development, sustainable agriculture, green industrialization, as well as thematic focus on competition and cooperation with China. A few weeks ago, we published the first major output of the initiative, the Rihla Handbook, a guide to accelerating Gulf climate finance in the global South. Last week, we also released the first 3 policy briefs, outlining GCC priorities in investment abroad, as well as the challenges and opportunities for expanding Gulf climate finance in the Middle East and in Africa. I encourage you to explore these publications as they reflect the insights and recommendations from our policy council members, as well as the Rihla team. Earlier this month, we launched the panel series in Abu Dhabi, continued in Rabat, and now in Pretoria. We'd like to invite you to register for our next panel taking place in Bangkok on October 2nd and Almaty next week. More details will be available on our website. All these publications and events are leading up to our Rihla Policy Forum that will take place in November in Doha, ending the first phase of our work. The implementation phase then starts and will continue until the Rihla Summit on Gulf Climate Finance that will be taking place in September 2026 in Abu Dhabi. It is especially meaningful to convene here in South Africa at this juncture, a country that has become a continental leader in renewable energy and green industrial policy and a vital partner for the Gulf as we think about the future of cooperation with the Sub-Saharan Africa. It is also fitting that this panel is taking place during the South Africa's G20 presidency. I hope today's discussions will not only generate the insights from our policy work, but also spark new partnerships and ideas among all of us here in the room and online. Today's panels are an opportunity to test our analysis against the realities and priorities of Sub-Saharan Africa and to hear directly from experts who are shaping the agenda on the ground, both in the Gulf and in Africa. Lastly, I would like to thank the Rihla team, especially Buisfa today, for coordinating the panel with Jordan and the SAIA team. Thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to our discussion.
Fantastic, so much. Thank you so much. We move now on to our next agenda item. We're going to be hearing an address delivered on behalf of the ambassador by Ms. Fatima Al-Suwadi. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Alex and Mehran. It's an honor to join you today at this event organized by Rihla and SAIA. We meet here today to explore a vital question. The question is, how can Gulf capital and African opportunity meet together to drive renewable energy, green hydrogen, and sustainable value chain? The urgency is clear. Africa contribute less than 4% of global emissions, yet faces some of the world's greatest climate risk. At the same time, it holds 60% of the world's best solar resources, but accounts for 1% of installed capacity. This gap is only a challenge. Not only a challenge, but it's an opportunity for us. The obstacle is a cost. So financing a renewable project in Africa remains 2 to 3 times more expensive than in advanced economics. This is where Gulf financing can make difference by lowering risk, blending, and making projects bankable. The UAE is already stepping up. So between 2018 and 2023, Emirati investment in the Africa reached up to 110 US billion dollar, including 72 billion US dollar in renewable energy. At COP28, we launched Africa Green Investment Initiative, backed with 4.5 billion US dollar, escalate a clear energy project across the continent. South Africa, within the advanced financial system, renewable, ambitious, and critical minerals, is a natural gateway for the partnership. Our collaboration with the Public Investment Corporation is just one example of what is possible. To move forward, 3 priorities must guide us. Number 1, strong framework that give investors confidence. Number 2, blending finance and risk and reduce risk and unlock scale. Investment in people and value chain, ensuring Africa transition is also just and inclusive. Ladies and gentlemen, imagine a continent where solar corridor light up, where South Africa explore green hydrogen, and where African minerals fuel the world's clean technology. It's not a distant dream, it's within our reach. So in United Arab Emirates stand up ready as a strategic and reliable partner, committed not just to invest, but also to co-create Africa green. Thank you so much, and I wish you all a very fruitful discussion today. And thank you, Alex and Mehran. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll then invite our first panel that we're exploring main drivers of Gulf financing in Sub-Saharan Africa forward, with moderator Vuyiswa Shlongwane, the Rihla coordinator for Sub-Saharan Africa. We also have a mic up front.
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Vuyiswa Shlongwane. I am the regional coordinator for Sub-Saharan Africa, and I'm so thankful to have you all in the room, and good morning to everybody that is online. This morning, sorry, let me just adjust this. Our session this morning really just asks the big question: what's driving Gulf financing into Sub-Saharan Africa, and how can we ensure that it delivers the desired impact? The conversation is rooted in our Rihla handbook, as well as the Gulf policy brief, as well as the recently published Sub-Saharan African brief, all of these are accessible on our webpage. So we have three excellent panelists, and I'll give them an opportunity to just introduce themselves. We have Kudakwashe Manjonjo, who is the Just Transition Advisor at PowerShift Africa. We have Humza Sheikh, a UAE-based sustainability professional, as well as Jordan McLean, a researcher at SIA. So I think I'll give it to each of you just to maybe just give us an introduction on who you are and what exactly how you contribute into the space. Kuda, I'll start with you. Is it? Okay.
Figured it out. Thanks so much, Lisa. Thank you for the introduction. Yes, so quick and short. Yes, as she said, my name is Kuda Manjonjo. I always remind people I come from the most beautiful town in the world, Victoria Falls, in Zimbabwe. I urge you to make a trip as soon as you can for those who have not. But more to the point that you've asked, the main work that I do at PowerShift Africa is the Just Transition Advisor. But I like to say that I'm in the business of how to make things on the continent, focusing on transition minerals and green industrialization, what that could look like, and how to best position ourselves in terms of regional integration and supporting each other. So as much as I'm Zimbabwean, I think I'm first of all African, and then I just happen to be born in the province of Zimbabwe. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure being here this morning. I'll have to challenge you on the most beautiful city in the world. I was born and raised in Calgary, Alberta, in Canada, and you can see the Northern Lights, most evenings. So, but I look forward to you welcoming me in Victoria Falls. My name is Hamza Sheikh. For the last 2.5 years, I've been at a UAE-based NGO that's been at the intersection of climate policy and innovation. And I spent the last 2.5 years engaging with the industries across the UAE to understand what the net zero gaps are and how policy and innovation can be leveraged for that drive forward the UAE's climate ambitions. I'll admit the Sub-Saharan African market is a bit new to me, so I'm excited to hear the discussions today and go back to the UAE with some valuable insights on how we can collaborate. Thank you.
Thanks, Vuiswa. Thank you to my co-panelists. My name is Jordan McLean. I'm a climate policy researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs. It's really an honor to be on this panel with people whose work I've followed for quite some time, and to be embarking on this new partnership with the Rihla initiative, supported, of course, by the Embassy of the UAE. The work that I do is primarily focused on South Africa's engagement in the BRICS grouping, as well as the G20. As you know, this year South Africa is the president of the G20. There's been a lot of work that has gone on behind the scenes that SIA has proudly contributed to. But I think part of what we've learned from this experience is the importance of new partnerships in order to advance Africa's development agenda. So I think this dialogue fits in squarely with those lessons learned, and I look forward to the unfolding conversation.
Thank you so much for those introductions. I think if we can just delve straight into it. Kuda, so you've been working on just transitions and Africa's role in critical minerals and green industrialization. So if the Gulf investment is coming in stronger, how do we make sure that it doesn't just repeat extractive patterns, but actually builds African industrial capacity and jobs?
Thanks for that, Visa. And I think the best way to tackle the question that you've mentioned here is to have that history that you just mentioned, where this is not the first time Africa is being invested in. We've had at least 500 years of investment on the continent, but for obvious reasons that I'm sure we're all aware of, we have not got to the stage where we expect. When I started doing a lot more of this work, it was actually shocking to me that GCC invests more than China. There's this idea that China is the biggest investor on the continent, but it's actually the Gulf countries that actually invest more on the African continent. And as mentioned earlier, there's specific things that they're focusing on. And for obvious reasons, with the transition minerals that are basically going to be the bedrock of where we think not just Africa, but the world has to be. That's the main driver in terms of what is driving investment to the continent. We have that statistic, right, that 30% of critical minerals are in Africa, but more to the point, 80% of them are in the SADC region. And that's very important because that basically means there's an opportunity to change the manner in which we have designed our industries and our communities to get a certain result. And it's fortunate that we have a SADC block already that do have relationships. So how then do we have a GCC relationship with, for example, in this case, the SADC region? As I've shared, my bias is very African. And I strongly believe one way to change the nature from what was usually extractive is to embed the industrial policy we have on a regional basis. Why is this important? Once we stop looking at our mines as national assets and start seeing them as regional assets, what happens is that you attract better investment. You're not doing what we call the race to the bottom, which usually happens when, for example, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Mozambique, and South Africa are all looking for the same $100 billion from the UAE, and they're essentially trying to uh, be the best bride at a wedding to basically say, listen, we can give you this, we can give you this. But the reality on the ground is that we've actually seen that we then reduce our environmental safeguards, our social safeguards, our governance safeguards, and this idea of trying to attract investment. And that's very dangerous because that's basically the basis of how, for example, Western Europe invested in Africa, how China has been investing in Africa. So that, first of all, is important, that regional integration. But more important, it's extremely important for the investment to be embedded in the policies that are already there. There's this assumption, which I think is very erroneous, that Africa does not have enough policies, and they're fantastic policies. SADC industrial strategy is already there. The Africa Green Mineral Strategy is already there. And I'll give a very pointed example to then finish off my introduction here to say that Councillor mentioned the Africa Green Investment Initiative, right? Which is a fantastic policy. But at the same time, there's something called the Africa Green Industrialization Initiative, which has been led by African countries. And they were both set up and are being prepared at the same time, focusing on the exact same things. So there's a definite need to align the policies that are coming from the GCC with what is already on the continent. That way, we don't then see the African policies as talk shops, but actually they're actually there to then support the potential partnerships that are there. And then this speaks finally to the SADC region. I had the fortune of being in Madagascar for the SADC summit, and there the heads of state launched what is called the North-South Corridor, which is essentially a corridor that's going to be linking about 10 countries in the SADC region, focusing on critical minerals, industrialization, etc. I know we all know about the Lobito corridor. I think that's very famous now when it comes to critical minerals. But this North-South corridor is inbred from the SADC region, and has the potential to then speak to the policies that are already there and see how do we guide our heads of state and our investment partners to invest in those corridors that are coming from the region itself. Thanks.
That's really good. Thanks so much, Kuda. I'll circle back to a few points that you made there, but I think I'll move to Humza. Your work has primarily been at the intersection of policy, innovation, and entrepreneurship, from carbon solutions to the circular economy. So, from where you sit in the Gulf, what do you see as the most promising innovations or financing models that could make the Gulf capital in sub-Saharan Africa not just bigger, but smarter and more sustainable?
Right. So, I guess the first part of your question, one thing that I've noticed working across the sectors is that there's an interplay and there's a connection between every industry. Waste from one industry is a feedstock to another industry. And seeing in the UAE the partnerships that are formed between industries in order to decarbonize and in order to, I guess, push forward the circular economy agenda. So that's one thing. So in terms of waste processing, in terms of carbon dioxide removal, in terms of we have an EV strategy, we have a hydrogen strategy. So I think the Gulf, it's not just one solution. It's there are interconnected solutions across the industries. The second part of your question, if you can repeat that.
The second part is, what do you see as the most promising innovations or financing models that could make Gulf capital in sub-Saharan Africa? Yeah.
So financing models, I think we have the example of the recent PPP, between EMEA and ESCOM here. So I think that's a blended finance models would be the best way to go forward to de-risk these large projects. These are capital intensive projects. They require long investment horizons, shorter ROI compared to some of the other investment sectors. So patience, blended finance models, and a collaboration between at the federal level, at the industry level as well.
Okay, no, thank you so much. I think I'll move on to Jordan. So Jordan, maybe you can tell us a little bit about, since you've obviously researched, you mentioned policymaking, inclusive policymaking in Southern Africa. A lot of Gulf investments at the moment have been bilateral and project driven. So from a governance and maybe policy standpoint, how, in your opinion, can we make sure that Gulf capital actually aligns with African climate strategies and not necessarily just bypass them for their own agenda?
Thanks, Reese. Well, I think already both Hamza and Kudakwashe have touched on this, in the fact that not only do we have national development plans which speak directly to the country's objectives in terms of engineering some green economic growth, but also we have a number of continental initiatives and continental strategies that are already underway. So for instance, what comes to my mind is the African Union Climate Change Strategy, which was launched in 2022, if I'm not mistaken, which is really broad in terms of the specific thematic areas that it focuses on. But throughout each section, you will see specific highlighting of how the AU wants to direct these initiatives towards addressing the livelihood challenges that we face on the continent, and that's poverty, unemployment, our huge youth dividend that is not currently being exploited, really. So I think that is sort of a starting point. We do have these frameworks, we do have these strategies that are already there. They're publicly available. They kind of put to investors on a plate, this is how we want our economies to grow. And I think what Gulf countries have done really well, and that goes back to Kuda's point of why they are the top sort of financing agent on the continent, is that they are looking at, where are opportunities to kind of commercialize this, to try and bring in scale in terms of addressing these shortfalls in Africa's development. So really, it's just about bringing those two imperatives together. There is this finance from Gulf countries. There's ideas. There's a lot of technology and opportunities that Gulf countries have already identified that need to be matched more closely and more directly with Africa's own development objectives, which are outlined in these strategies. Of course, a major challenge is the coordination of all of these different frameworks and how they feed into each other from the national or even the local level through to the regional. So Kuda's touched on SADC, but then even bigger than that to the AU level. And I think where that comes into play is looking sort of beyond the bilateral kind of model. There are synergies with Gulf investors that need to kind of be unlocked. It is difficult, but I think through dialogue and through sort of a sustained campaign of African governments being very clear of what they want, because they've already come up with this development sort of strategy, taking that to these meetings, to the sort of foundational meetings of these partnerships with Gulf companies and Gulf governments, I think will be a key way of sort of addressing this.
Thank you so much, Jordan. And I've been made aware that Ashraf has joined us online as the fourth panelist member. So I think I will hand over to you, Ashraf, if you could just maybe introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about yourself before I ask our first question to you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. It's a pleasure being here attending this event with you today. Apologies, I'm getting a bit of an echo, so it's a bit difficult for me to hear properly. So I'm the Business Development Director for Southern Africa for Infinity Power, who is a pure play renewable energy IPP and fully dedicated to the African continent. Apologies, it's just this echo is a bit distracting. So in terms of Infinity Power as a company, So we have 1.3 gigawatts of operational assets split between wind and solar over the African continent, between South Africa, Egypt, and Senegal. And we have a target to reach 10 gigawatts of operational assets by 2030. We are well on our way to reach 5 gigawatts of operational assets in 2028 across South Africa, Egypt, and new projects in Cote d'Ivoire. So in South Africa, we were successful in rebid Windows 7, winning 1.3 gigawatts of PV projects, which is now on its way to financial close. So hopefully in Q1 next year, these should be hitting financial close. We have another 2 gigawatts that we are working on a bilateral basis with the Egyptian government, supposed again to hit COD by latest 2028. Plus, we were also the successful bidders for the scaling solar projects in Cote d'Ivoire for 2 times 80 megawatts. And Infinity Power is backed by, and the link with the UAE comes from one of our main shareholders, Masdar, which is the renewable energy arm of the Abu Dhabi government. And also Infinity Power is backed by other shareholders, by the Mansour Group, also European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD, and Africa Finance Corporation, which is, which has member states from the African continent. I'll just pause here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think while I still have you online, I'd like to ask you a question in what do you see as the main drivers pulling Gulf capital into Sub-Saharan Africa right now?
All right. No, I think one of the main drivers in terms of the policies that are into place by the government and the bankable structure that we put around in terms of public-private partnerships. If I just go back to the example of South Africa, who've been doing it very well through the REAP program, which has been in place since 2009, and now we've just finished the 7th edition of REAP, which attracts actually investors from all around the world, including European investors. Most recently, over the past two free rounds, investors from the Middle East, in companies like ourselves, Infinity Power, Amia Power, and Aqua Power, have all actively participated by submitting PV projects, battery energy storage projects, and we try to also bring the technical expertise from the GCC countries to Southern Africa. And South Africa, to be fair to the country, it's one of the leaders on the African continent when it comes to the deployment of renewable energy projects. So we look forward to continuing building on that. And one thing that's important for us as investors coming into Southern Africa is the liberalization of the market. And again, we've seen South Africa as one of the leading figures there by the free operating of the private sector, with the energy traders being in place, and with the SAWEM, which is the South Africa Wholesale Energy Electricity Market, coming into place over the next couple of years, which will have a day-ahead market and an hour-ahead market. So all that brings more confidence to investors to come into the country, because at the end of the day, it's not just a view that we have to take on the single off-taker, but in case, and again, it's important to the financiers, there are other alternatives in terms of distributing the energy supply within the country. And I think this is a model that should be replicated ideally across Sub-Saharan Africa. We understand that it's not obvious to start with such a liberalized model, with most of the countries facing a monopoly in terms of energy supply. However, in the long run, this will be the way forward for the installation of renewable energy projects and the development of the infrastructure in Southern Africa.
And I'll just maybe go to Hamza, actually. So Sub-Saharan Africa has vast renewable energy and critical minerals. Which sectors do you see as the greatest opportunity for transformative Gulf investments in the region?
Yeah, so I think first of all, it's important to sort of recognize that there's this really strong sort of policy framework in the UAE. We have a net zero strategy, a national net zero strategy. We have a circular economy policy that's been developed. We have a hydrogen strategy and even an EV strategy. So, given, you mentioned minerals and the renewable corridors that was also mentioned. I think each of those strategies clearly outline where the gaps are, where the opportunities are, and just going by the EV strategy, I think there's definitely some synergy in like the metals and the minerals that are required in the entire EV infrastructure and EV charging and EV development space. So right off the bat, I think that's one. Hydrogen as well. There's a lot of work being done, with through Masdar, but through Masdar and green hydrogen, but also natural hydrogen is also something that's come up recently in the UAE. Not sure, how that translates into this region, but yeah, I think the energy transition space broadly and narrowing into the EV space and the the battery electric storage as well. I think those are some areas that there's definitely some synergies there.
100%. And I think also just adaptation in water and agri is also a good one in the
Definitely.
sector. Yeah.
Water
so
security, food security as well, right?
100%. Thank you. So Kuda, maybe I'll just then pivot to you. So in line with the adaptation in water rather, and agriculture and how heavily underfunded it is in the region, what role do you think, in your opinion, could Gulf actors play here? And what lessons maybe could we draw from their own experiences from such sectors?
Yeah, thank for that, Lisa. And I think here there are two very obvious things, right? Technology around how to best have the right water saving technology around water, the right infrastructure technology when it comes to not only saving the technology, but making sure you're using the water efficiently. We all know how the GCC region is, generally speaking, a very desert intense area. So the question then becomes, what can the Southern African region, or even the general Sub-Saharan area benefit from this? We do know we have the Sahara Desert for quite a number of the North Sub-Saharan countries. Here in Southwest Africa, there is, generally speaking, a desert intense region. So how then do we translate a lot of the technologies that are used in the GCC region to then support what's happening on the African continent? So that's the first thing I'll say. Then the next thing, which I think is also important, and this speaks to the type of investment and how financing should be done. There is an issue where the financing that is coming onto the continent is still a bit expensive. This is why I think we've talked about the blended financing that was mentioned a bit earlier, or the public-private partnerships. And I think beyond saying blended in finance, it's important to have mission-oriented blended financing, to say that when the African countries are looking for investment, they are very particular in terms of this is the type of infrastructure investment we want. South Africa is a very good example of that, where when they do get investors, they have basically a list of priority infrastructure investments that they would like the investment to be directed to. And I think on the continent, we need to be a bit better in terms of that, in terms of saying that these are our priorities, because there is a danger of blended finance sometimes, where it then is moved towards what we would say is more attractive in terms of return on investment, rather than actually lifting up the people who need the investment the most. So for example, your lower income regions and the likes and the likes. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And then I'll move to Jordan. So a lot of the Gulf-backed projects in the space are quite bilateral. So how can we ensure that these investments align with, this is the question that I asked you before, sorry. So I'm asking, in terms of financial, I'm not sure how well versed you are in terms of the financial instruments, because a lot of the panelists did mention having blended financing instruments. So of all of these, based on your work, based on the region, even including things like sovereign wealth funds and the different blended finance models that they they mentioned, which hold the most power and which have proven to kind of be the most effective in the sub-Saharan African region when it comes to foreign investment in the green energy space?
Sure, thank you so much. I think it's a difficult question because each African country's particular conditions are very different. So obviously South Africa's sort of ability and capacity to absorb finance, to co-design particular instruments that will work for our country's needs are very different to maybe the capacities of other states like Malawi or Kenya. So I think there isn't one specific instrument that is sort of the silver bullet to dealing with Africa's financing issues. I think what is a lot more important, and it's something that is a priority for South Africa's G20 presidency, and that is actually looking at ways, exactly as the councillor mentioned, to de-risk, so that the cost of financing is a lot more affordable for African countries. So we already face extremely high premiums compared to other regions in the world, and this really hampers the continent's efforts and country level efforts to try to finance their own development. So addressing the cost of capital, it's a huge challenge. It requires so much. It requires, really taking a hard look at how credit rating agencies operate. It really requires looking at the entire reform of the international financial architecture. And these are really big questions, really existential ones, where, African leaders have been quite clear and quite demanding with sort of the future that they see. So yeah, just to go back to your question on which particular model works, which is it blended finance, is it trying to prefer public private partnerships, it varies across the continent. I think at the end of the day, trying to orient our partnerships around exactly what Kuda mentioned, mission-oriented finance, and looking at our partners from the perspective of what is the expertise that they have, like Hamza mentioned, looking at, for example, electric vehicles are also a priority for South Africa as part of our just energy transition. That's really the best way. Once you put the objectives together, I think the financing model then can appear, because you've not only put the objectives together, but you've also looked at the specific country context and where is the best way for the country to try and take in and attract the most finance that it can. So yeah, that's that really big question, but I think that's the best way I can answer it.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And I think I'll just, Ashraf, if I can just invite you into this conversation. When Jordan mentioned that it kind of is not a one size fits all, essentially. Different regions in SSA will need different ways, different financing methods. So when I go to the issue of maybe policy framework and in your work and in your exposure when it comes to, because both of the Gulf as well as the Sub-Saharan Africa briefs made it very clear that without the right frameworks, Gulf capital won't deliver legitimacy. So what kinds of policy and governance frameworks, in your opinion, could be essential to ensure that there is a certain level of transparency, accountability, and inclusion when it comes to Gulf financing in the Sub-Saharan Africa?
Yeah, thank you. I just would like to reiterate what Jordan said. Right, there's no one solution for all when it comes to financing. Usually, it's about putting the practical solution and the dedicated scope together, and then bring in the financing, and then the right financing will fall into place with a lot of instruments that are available. In terms of the policies, that makes investors more comfortable going into a specific region, I think we need to see a broad strategy coming from the government itself in terms of the whole procurement that they put in place. Depending on the countries, some countries have a very established competitive procurement process that they have to respect. And I think that's important to ensure that the African continent has access to competitive and cheap renewable energy in terms of the electricity supply. But aside from the competitive pricing, I think it's important to to build investors' confidence into the different countries. And this will vary again, similar to how different projects attract different types of investment. I mean, different countries at different stage of development on the African continent will necessitate a different framework for the implementation of green energy projects. So, for example, in advanced market like South Africa, Egypt, competitive tenders and all have worked well because the investors are well versed with the space. However, in countries who are now starting to with the development of renewable energy and green energy technologies, maybe it starts with a PPP or with a bilateral, because by doing a first project with an anchor sponsor, it builds the confidence of other investors when they see how the first PPA, how the first power purchase agreement is going in the country, the track record when it comes to the payment of dues, and this helps as well decrease the cost of financing, because then we can have a conversation with the financiers and say, okay, your credit agency is giving this and that rating for such country, and this necessitates you to raise the premium when it comes to the financing of the project. Then we can look at the show the track record of the country, like look at this utility and look at in worst cases where you've seen the utility maybe fall into default for uh, for any reason which would come into place, but then to see the government come in and back the payment obligations of such a utility. I mean, these are things that we can use when we bring a project to credit committees to make sure that we can get competitive cost of financing, while also getting our shareholders, our governments comfortable putting the equity required for those projects.
Thanks so much. And I just want to circle back to Kuda. You had mentioned that there's, apart from just capital, beyond capital, there's a lot more that the Gulf can do in the region to kind of better prepare and position SSA to receive these types of funds. And you spoke about technology transfer and just upskilling in that regard. Do you want to maybe just unpack what role these Gulf players could play, apart from just obviously the technology transfer, in the whole capacity building and institutional partnerships that they can provide in the region?
That's a big question, but I'll go for it. And why I say it's a big question is because of the latter part of that around institutional capacity, because it becomes tricky when what institutions are we focusing on? And at least from my theory of change, when I think about this, I'm always asking myself, when we're thinking of this transition, how do we ensure that the transition is equitable and accessible to all as much as possible? I think we've had the situation where we have very specific countries that are way ahead of other ones, and that's dangerous, right? Because what you then happen is you have migration issues, crises that South Africa is very aware of in Southern Africa, or in the Egypt situation when it comes to Northeast Africa. So my question there becomes, how do you leverage a country that is leading to then take up the rest of the region? And that's part of the institutional capacity where I think GCC is important. So when we speak about regional integration, we shouldn't think about it as if 10 countries are agreeing to one policy at the same time. It would be great, for example, for GCC to focus on how do they have a relationship, and I'll give green hydrogen as an example. I'm aware Namibia and South Africa are concretely trying to think, how do we have a relationship around green hydrogen? The same should be done for Zimbabwe, green hydrogen, specifically focusing on decarbonization of heavy industries such as steel and cement. That's how, for example, institutional capacity that focuses on very project-based but realistic multinational projects. And they're two very big reasons for this. You're increasing the economy of scale, where it's not only South Africa government that is basically backing this. Zimbabwe and Namibia will be willing to support this. And at the same time, you're actually increasing the opportunity of getting good returns, because you're not dealing with 60 million people. You're dealing with, let's say, 100 million people for those three countries. So the realistic aspect of institutional capacity for me with GCC investment is to have some of these multinational projects that GCC financing can support, and then take it further to then say, this is how we can then make sure that we're increasing regional integration, but at the same time increasing that idea of regional integration, and it's a win-win for both of us.
You did well in answering that big question. So Humza, maybe I'll come to you. And just from where you sit, obviously you have the Canadian and Gulf lens, if I could say that. And do you see investors in the region and the policymakers becoming more intentional about climate smart partnerships in Africa, or is it still something that's a little bit secondary in terms of their priorities in investing in the region?
So I'll quote a PwC study couple of last year. They quoted climate tech investment around 3 billion from the GCC into climate tech. Only 43 million of that actually stayed in the GCC. So in terms of implementing new projects, I think the GCC is very risk averse to do it in the GCC itself. And I know, we talk about, and this is something that I'd like to hear your opinion on, the lack of appetite to test new technologies within the GCC. That sort of falls on, other countries, other regions. I would maybe, on that lens, I'd maybe want to hear what you have to say on, is that equitable? Is it fair for other regions, for this region, to bear the risk of new technologies here as a test bed for the UAE? And how can a more collaborative approach to testing new technologies be shared between the two countries? One of the biggest problems or challenges I face dealing with climate technologies that were ready, that were, TRL 8, TRL 9, just ready to commercialize. They just needed that one pilot project, which industry demanded, and they did not have. So perhaps a relationship can be built along those lines where, perhaps technology can be piloted in these corridors in this region. But again, I'm very aware that does not always seem like an equitable relationship. So I would want to ask how to make that relationship equitable from this region's perspective.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know, Jordan, do you want to have a go at his?
Sorry to put you.
I think it's difficult, this dynamic that Hamza is sort of raising, because there is definitely an appetite from the continent for technology, and especially when the technology doesn't just come in, sort of fly in and sort of be operated by foreign sort of companies, but if it is sort of engineered and presented in a way where there's possibilities for young African people to actually be capacitated to form their own expertise in specific countries where these technologies are being sort of tested. I think Hamza is not incorrect. It is, as Africa, we don't want to be a testing ground for anything. We really want to be in control of sort of the new innovations that are being tested here. And to another extent, I think there is already so much innovation that is sort of happening indigenously on the continent that is requiring some kind of financial support in order to launch it to sort of operate at a bigger scale. So there's kinds of two sides to that relationship. I think I respect Gulf countries for their openness and their willingness to sort of look at the African market as a way to launch some of these technologies and to see if these can have real impact. But sort of the flip side is that, we aren't a region that does not innovate. So how do we bring those two groups kind of together to have sort of some technological advancements happening on the continent that are informed maybe by what's happening in the Gulf region, but is sort of building on sort of the basis and the platforms that we already have as African innovators.
Yeah.
I think
No,
Kuda
thank you.
wanted to add.
Yeah, Kuda did want to add. Go ahead, Kuda.
Sorry, I think I'm addicted to technology when it comes to some of these things. And I think we have to broaden our minds around what technologies we're looking for, right? For example, in the critical mineral space, it annoys me that everyone thinks we're focusing on solar and wind, like the actual panels and stuff. That's part of it. That's the end. the continent actually just needs material processing technology, right? Metal processing technology, very basic, but extremely important. Basically, when talk about material processing, how efficiently when you're mining copper, instead of getting 60% of the copper, you're getting 90% of the copper. That is extremely specific. And the GCC has some of that technology. They're just investing in Zambia now, and we're hoping that they get that. So we have to broaden our minds about what kind of technology. Another one is grid technology, smart grids, and how we're actually needing to embed renewable energy. It's a running joke right now back in my home country that some of our grid, we don't have the technology to embed renewable energy into the national grid. This is very basic, very accessible technology. And I think once we start doing that, we stop zoning in on specific types of technology and we realize that we need more. And in terms of if some countries are willing to be tested, I think Namibia around green hydrogen are more than ready. They have been pushing. So you do see differences in terms of countries. Namibia wants to be a first mover, as they call it. The first mover advantage, I think that's the commercial term. So it's always different depending on what technology and depending on the industry. But I do think there's space for that.
Thank you so much. And I don't know, Ashraf, if you have a response to Humza's question. I think we've all now.
Yes, so I mean, I think what could help maybe I mean everybody picture what Hamza meant could be maybe a couple of examples from his side, and maybe we can elaborate from there in terms of what type of technologies he was referring to in terms of doing some a testing phase on the African continent.
Hey, Hamza, do you wanna?
Yeah, so it's pretty open-ended. It's pretty general. But for example, waste to energy, we've got 4 or 5 different waste to energy solutions that we found that were very promising, but industry was reluctant to implement any of the 4 just because they wanted a pilot project. So that's just one example. We can use that as a template for any application.
Okay. No, thank you for the Hamza. I think that's quite helpful. I think one of the challenge that we might see here, while I think it's a good idea, but for example, if technology is struggling to get the go ahead, let's say in the GCC countries, where usually the financiers are more comfortable funding projects, then it could become even more difficult to have that to do that stepping stone in the on the African continent. Although scale could be a factor as well. So, for example, if something needs to be tested, doesn't necessarily have to be on a large scale like we used to in the GCC region, but it could be a scaled out version that's done on the African continent. And again, maybe in certain specific cases, because of the smaller scale, it could be fully backed by equity, right? And while doing those development, the technology development on the African continent, I mean, there's the community aspect as well, community and capacity building. So the countries who are running the test case can then benefit, like the communities from those countries would be benefiting from everything that comes with the project in terms of infrastructure that's created around it, and opportunities for growth and for training of the local people as well. So I think, yeah, in that sense it could be a win-win, but most likely those test cases would have to be equity backed.
Thank you so much, Ashraf. And I think I'd like to open up the floor for any discussion or any questions that you may have for any of our panelists. I'm not sure if we even have questions online, but yeah, maybe we can take maybe 1 or 2 from the audience before we go back to the panelists. Miran, please, an extra mic. Oh, there we go.
Thank you very much. Very insightful session. Thank you. We had a meeting last week in Rabat, and we were discussing, for example, how Morocco wants to be a hub, let's say, in between Europe and Africa. And their priority was to basically position themselves as an Africa hub. And my question here is, considering also with the Infinity project and all of the examples mentioned this morning, even from Egypt to down to South Africa, is there is there room for looking at the continent in a continental manner, in the sense that inclusion of North Africa within our discussions on Sub-Saharan Africa, to basically, this is something that we've been discussing also internally, whether it's there's merit in merging North Africa with Sub-Saharan Africa in our discussions, particularly when it comes to renewable energy development and these corridors that you're mentioning.
Thank you. Kuda, do you wanna the first on my left?
I guess I'm the guy who's arguing for Africa, so I have
Yeah.
to take this. No, and I think there is. I sometimes struggle to say Sub-Saharan Africa because I do a lot of my research. I focus it from an African point of view, and there are reasons for this. So I'll give the critical minerals example, where I think Morocco owns about 70% of phosphate. Guinea has about 80% of bauxite. So what then happens? And I'll give the minerals example. We always have this idea in our heads. How amazing would it have been if the African Union, during just the G20, organized with the ministries of mining from the key countries of the continent? That's Morocco, that's Guinea, Zambia, DRC, Zimbabwe, South Africa, with the minerals that we have. And we negotiated to say, listen, these are the minerals on the continent. These are the priorities in terms of investment. This is what we're expecting. It's a different conversation. What is happening right now? There's too much of a nation-based negotiation, and they're picking and choosing who's going to end up with investment. So there is room to, because the continent is one, and there's so many spaces where we do align. The Africa Free Trade Agreement, that is not based on Sub-Saharan or North Africa. It's very much an African thing. So once we have a focus area like that, it actually increases the room and power of the continent. And I'm glad that Morocco is thinking about that as a recent African Union member, because they're extremely important. And it is good. Morocco is positioned in a great place to be the gateway, right? But that's not the only gateway. Africa is a country, but it's a very big country, and it'll be a gateway to Europe. But maybe Tanzania will be the gateway to East Asia, West Asia, for example. So that would be my answer to that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add because I think Kuda's been quite comprehensive, but I think continental integration is one of the top sort of priorities for the African Union. It's how the AU has structured its entire the Agenda 2063. Regional integration is sort of at the top of the list. I think the it doesn't come from nowhere. It's from the understanding that, if you are trying to build value chains, you can't have this sort of separation between South and North, because then your value chain is broken in itself. So I think, in terms of bringing North Africa into the Sub-Saharan Africa conversation, it's like Kuda says, Africa is Africa. We have similar issues all around. Our country contexts are different. So I think you need to respect country context and even some regional dynamics. Like there are particular things happening in the Horn that may be different to what's happening, in Central Africa, where a lot of our minerals are. But the development, we can only really develop if we sort of plan our development together. I think that's sort of the main message of the African Union.
Thank you so much. I just want to turn to the floor again. Do we have, oh, hi, yes, please, Fatima, please go ahead. Can we get, thank you so much.
Hello, hello.
I'd like to thank the panelists. I have a question for Kuda. You mentioned earlier about the material process, and you gave us example about Namibia and Zambia. Can you elaborate more about the technology and the material process? Thank you.
Do you want to just take it? Then I'll go.
Okay, so I mean, in the mining sector, we call it the 3 M's, right? There's the mineral, metal, material. That's essentially the value chain for any product that you're creating. So we focus on the end thing, which is the material, which is fine, your wafers and the likes. But in terms of the actual processing of metal processing, material processing, so there's certain technologies where it's more efficiently mining more efficiently mining what's already there. So for example, with things like cobalt and copper, where there's a lot of artisanal miners, there could be investment in that space to give them better technologies to mine more efficiently, because we also have to accept we can't mine forever. That's something we don't say that in Africa, I know, but we can't keep mining. It's a big problem, right? So when we do mine, we need to mine a lot more efficiently. And I can give you some research to that. And I think it's extremely important because those are low hanging fruits in terms of technology transfer. And usually what happens, the big corporates have that technology, your Rio Tintos and the likes, but your small scale miner will also do a lot of the mining for certain materials, and minerals don't have access to that technology. But it could be an outsized impact in terms of how we actually respond to some of the development issues that we have. Yeah, so hopefully that helps.
Thank you so much. We have one question at the back. Please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tato Mazwe Madibo. I am the co-founder and vice chairman of Amari African Mines of Applied Research Institute. My question is just pointed at the first speaker. Oh, let me also just recognize all the speakers. Thank you so much for the engagement. I think it's very dangerous when we discuss regionalism, and I'm going to explain why. Because regionalism also can cause polarization and prioritizing particular sectors over continental priorities. And I think we're kind of already seeing that. I think the gentleman before me, I was actually a bit upset. I should have picked up my hand quickly because it kind of, our questions are quite in line with one another. Where we see, of course, North Africa and likewise Western Africa kind of prioritizing themselves over the agenda of the greater continent. So that's number one. Secondly, just to add some color in regards to commodities and critical resources. A while back, I think there's some colleagues also in the room who attended the Chatham House discussion on critical resources. And likewise, there I had spoken to on the floor, likewise, in regards to how the Algian bloc has done some great initiatives in regards to how they have made reforms to specifically, for example, nickel and copper, in terms of those particular sectors, like, for example, Malaysia and Indonesia, how those particular markets have seen, if I'm not mistaken, about 5 to 6% growth between 2021 and 2024. And I think that's a good focus for us as well here in Africa, likewise, that we can not necessarily copy, but this could be a good blueprint of how we can also look at how we analyze our particular policies. I hope you the panel, the experts on the panel can add some more enrichment in terms of that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
I think just on your last point in terms of looking at other regions maybe as a blueprint for some things that we need to maybe learn or implement in Africa. I think there's always two ways to look at it. So yes, there's been successes with regards to some of the mineral development decisions that have been made in Southeast Asia. But we also need to remember there were very particular conditions and very particular dynamics going on that allowed that success to emerge. So we as Africans need to look at our particular our country context, our regional dynamics to understand, you know, what is working, what is not working. Of course, we can always look to others to lessons, and that is the power of South-South cooperation. And not only for lessons, but also for support and investment, like we would look to Gulf states. But I think we have a lot more to gain right now where we are at trying to decipher what is working and what we can put more of our time, our effort, and our financing into. You know, the geopolitical space is extremely fragmented. It's changing every day. Today you have 30% tariffs, tomorrow you have 50. You know, we need to understand that it's more a game of being adaptable than it is looking at lessons that worked at a particular point in time. That's not to say that we don't have anything to learn from our partners. Of course we do. And through more dialogue and through more engagement, even the engagement that we're having today, I think that's where we see these lessons emerge. But it takes time and it takes a lot of inward reflection that I think maybe is not happening at the scale that we need it to in order to try and access those gains that we're after.
Thanks so much. Kuda, you can go ahead.
I just want to answer my brother's question around the continental regional thing. And I think it's a yes and no situation. I try to be realistic about this because I'm always told I think too African Union, too top down. And I think like what Jordan was saying in terms of understanding where our geopolitical situation is, Africa is not at a point where 54 countries are going to agree. We were at the Africa Climate Summit last week. It's very much known Egypt is against the Great Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia. You know, these are countries that are right next to each other and they're fighting. You know, DRC and Rwanda are fighting. So when I think of the continent in terms of what becomes an African strategy, when 2 or 3 countries are working together, that's part of the building block for the African Union. It does not have to be 54 at the same time. And we also have to remind ourselves, Africa is a huge place. It takes 12 hours from Cape Town to Rabat by flight. There's no other continent in the world. So we're doing something that's never been done, you know, and we have to put the context to that. Even the European Union, you know, it's as big as DRC, if I'm not mistaken, and they fight, you know, and we're doing essentially 6 times more than what the European Union was able to do in terms of uniting. So when I think of regional integration, is the building blocks to continental integration, and how we integrate will not be the same way, but at least all these bricks will come to then build this house that will hopefully live under as we go ahead.
Thank you so much. I don't know if there are any more questions on the floor. We have a few online that I'll just pose to the panel. So the first one is from one of our policy council members, actually, and he asks, how can GCC investments be directed into emerging green projects such as the geothermal or cross-country solar schemes that serve multiple nations? And what is the GCC's position on partnering with Chinese players in such initiatives? Similar to models where Western firms like Worldly or WeBuild collaborate with China Development Bank to finance projects globally. It's quite a mouthful, but I'll maybe start with you.
Yeah, so I guess the last question there was about China. There's so much collaboration happening between the GCC and China. We see it in just the EVs, for example, that we see coming through from China. There's at least a dozen of them that I can count on the road. So in terms of GCC China, you know, cooperation, I'd say it's in full swing. And I think the first part of the question was financing green projects.
Yes.
Yeah. Again, I think we kind of touched on this a bit earlier as well. Every project is different. There's when it comes to deep tech projects, these hard tech projects, the time horizons are so long. You have to kind of treat them on a case by case basis. The best way forward is to you know, have industries collaborate, right? So I mentioned waste, for example. I know I keep going back to that. I was working on something recently on that. But if you have the waste sector from this region, collaborating with the waste sector in the UAE or in the GCC in general, they know their context, they know their challenges that are related to their industry, and you know, leveraging the regulations and the country mandates from both sides. I'm sure they can come up with something, but it's hard to, you know, make a blanket statement where you've got so many different industries, so many different challenges, so many different technological solutions. But yeah, I know that's kind of sidestepping the question, but it is a reality that every project, every industry has its own set of you know, models that can be implemented.
Yeah. No, thank you so much. I don't know if any of the panelists want to take a stab at that, or I can move on to the next question. Oh, Jordan.
Just a point on the collaboration with China. So it's already happening between GCC and China, but in terms of the continent, I think what we're starting to see, and I think what we should be hoping to see much more is more of an openness to having all partners sort of at the table. It's really about how Africa can extract the best partnership that responds to our development needs. And sometimes sometimes it is very strategic to have your your prospective partners sort of try to outbid each other. I mean, we do, as Kuda mentioned, we do have the resources. We have a young continent. We have all of these plans and these goals, but what we're looking for is sort of the correct partner, and we've kind of moved past that phase of just looking at either our Western, our sort of traditional colonial partners. Now we are much more open. So you have the Gulf operating in Africa to a large scale, but there are other newcomers sort of to the game from Turkey or from other, Asian countries. So I think having your partners work together is even better because you are getting access to their networks, their expertise, and their financing to kind of try to catalyze some development opportunities for Africa as well.
Thank you so much. And so let me move on swiftly to the next question because we are pressed for time. The second one being, how can we develop partnerships that move beyond extractive contract models, ensuring that local communities receive meaningful returns rather than experiencing resource takeouts with little to no benefits? Yeah, I was about to say.
Okay, I'll be quick on this. So the worst problem in terms of this is what are called the bilateral investment treaties that our countries are signing, and they're very secretive and they're dangerous. It's some of the ones I've been given sight to. Communities are not mentioned. If they're mentioned, they're being told that we're moving them from A to B. It's a very state-led approach. We're making a deal. We'll deal with the rest. I won't mention the countries where these deals are being done. So a big part of how do we get communities involved is what's being called as FPIC, the free prior informed consent, which is not, and I'll use the word here, it's not sexy to corporates, unfortunately. And I think at least over the last 10, 15 years, that's becoming a lot more understood that you have to do that because the backlash is not worth it. When a community is now fighting back, saying that we don't want this mine to open, we don't want this industry to open. So in terms of that, the bilateral investment treaties, first of all, need to be more transparent and accountable. We do understand it's a state secret, but right now it's so hard to even get any information on them. And next thing you're being told has been sold off to the highest bidder. So I think that's a big part of the work that needs to be done. And hopefully we get more community engagement prior to the mining or the industry being opened from this job creation point of view and actually getting dividends so that the benefits are not just corporate or state-led, but they're also community-based.
Great, thank you so much, Kuda. And I'll just move on to the last question that we have in the chat. And that reads, hello to the panel. How do we prioritize investments from China and the GCC for renewable energy? For instance, China is financing big projects such as the Belt and Road Ad Initiative and Benguela Corridor. The China GCC conversation continues.
Yeah, but when it comes to China or the Gulf, I mean, I think African policymakers are really in quite an interesting position. We have our sort of development plans out there. We have our development plans, our climate plans, our specific green investment plans or strategies. And now you're being sort of approached by all of these partners that also have their own methods for investment and their own objectives that they need to deliver on in terms of taking it back home to where the finance comes from. And it's always a difficult marriage trying to bring those together, but it really is possible. I think really, even going back to the question before, being able as African policymakers to try and center your community to ensure that the development gains are being felt on the ground, not only in lofty things like this is our GDP or this is how much money has flowed into our country. I think that's very important, and there's a way to approach your partners, especially historic partners like the Gulf and like China, to try and design something that is as far as possible a win-win. It's not easy. I think, we do see sort of the news articles about, this horrible thing happened in this country with this funded by this country or whatever. It's a hard thing to manage, and it's something that as Africans we are still learning how to manage our partners. But it's not impossible. It's not insurmountable. We will get there the longer that we are open to engage. And that's another thing. We have to be open to all partners. Our development, our development needs are so large that we cannot finance them by ourselves. And being open to your partners and being sort of agile to their agendas is very important. You know, specifically on China, they do host the FOCAC, where they kind of bring all the African leaders together with Chinese with the Chinese government to try and better understand how to design the partnership and to design the financial flows. And I think that it's not a perfect model. It's very exclusionary. Communities are not represented there at all. However, it's still an important platform to ensure that there is some dialogue between, you know, how it looks from the outside, sort of the 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 giver and the receiver of the funds. So yeah, these are very big questions. Like I said, it's we need to start thinking a little bit more openly. It's not only China that's around. It's not only the Gulf. They're competing for the interest of African countries, and I think that's a good thing for us. We need to get the best deal that we can. We're in an age now of deal making, you know. So we have to get the best deal that's put on the table to us.
Thanks so much, Jordan. And Ashraf, I'll just hand over to you in regards to that particular question before we close.
Yes, thank you. So I just maybe I would like to reiterate what Hamza was saying in terms of the cooperation already happening, right, between the GCC and the and the Chinese companies and the China state. For example, and again, sorry, I'll just go back to what I'm more familiar with, which is, you know, the REAP program in South Africa, which brings, you know, which actually is a good example of GCC cooperation with Chinese entities when it comes to the construction. So what you would see, what we've seen in these programs is that the Chinese entities or Chinese-owned companies have kind of taken a step back when it comes to the development of those projects. They're happy to let GCC players like ourselves take the front foot, go ahead and secure the projects, etc. But then what they are willing to do is they are really important and very supportive in terms of the construction of those projects, because they have, you know, lots of experience executing within mainland China, as well as elsewhere in Europe, on the African continent. And they really bring a valuable aspect to the project in terms of the construction expertise and at very competitive pricing. So the cooperation there is already happening. Now, just to touch on another matter, which was, you know, asked by one of the people who addressed questions to the panel, in terms of economic development. And then again, I'll mention the REAP program, which has been really an example in terms of, you know, how renewable energy projects should be procured on the African continent, actually worldwide. Of course, there are some inefficiencies within the program that can be improved on, but largely I would say it's a very solid program. And it includes a firm economic development section to it. Like from the moment that you bid for a project, you already have to take into consideration, you know, who are the people that you're going to take from the local communities. What is the skills development that you're going to, what are the skills development program that you're going to finance as part of your project? And also it has a local procurement section to it as well, which promotes the local industry. Previously, unfortunately, in the last REAP round, they had to move away from it, but there was a localization aspect when it came to PV module sourcing, in terms of support structure sourcing, etc., where it would require that certain activities in terms of the value chain would have to sit in South Africa. So I think having such structured programs, and not only in South Africa, repeated across the African continent, is a way to safeguard, the local development when it comes to the industry development, the training of the local people, but also protect the interest of the communities surrounding the projects.
Thank you. Hello. Oh, there we go. Thank you so much, Ashraf. And now we've come to the end of our first panel discussion. Thank you so much to each and every panelist that has joined us, Kuda, Hamza, Jordan, and Ashraf. It's been really insightful and the first of hopefully many conversations that we'll have regarding the region. So right now we have a 15-minute tea break, followed by our second panel discussion moderated by Alex. So thank you so much, everyone.
esteemed delegates, if I could ask you to take your seats. It's always very encouraging when this very active networking is happening over the coffee breaks. But we do also have our online audience to think about. Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for joining for the second panel. We're going to zero in a little bit more on South Africa, specifically in this discussion, but I think you will find that there are connections with some of the broader themes that came up in the first panel, and reflecting also on South Africa's role within the broader continent. Thank you so much to my panelists for joining with me. We've, of course, got Miran here, who's already introduced himself. My colleague, Kirsten Pearson, who leads SAIA's climate finance work, and Cynthia Chiwenya, who is part of the Rihla Sub-Saharan African Policy Council. I invite any of my panelists, if they feel they want to provide a little bit more detail about themselves and their work, they're welcome to do so. When they have their first opportunity at the mic. But I wanted to start with a question to Miran. And when we think about Gulf Africa cooperation in the context of climate, just transition, our mind, certainly my mind, goes very quickly to renewable energy, solar, possibly wind and other, but certainly solar is very prominent. But I heard in your introductions to the Rihla initiative somewhat of a broader framing. And of course, we understand that when we think about climate change on the continent, it's not only energy provision, adaptation, resilience building is a big component of that. So the first question would be to reflect a little bit around possibly those broader areas of the focus that could potentially be missed as we focus specifically on the energy sector in some of these discussions. And then the second question is, you know, here in South Africa, we do sometimes get a little bit caught up with the challenges that we face. And in that discussion, challenges loom so large that often we forget or don't even see the opportunities. So it's an invitation, I guess, to reflect a little bit on the view from the Gulf when looking at South Africa in terms specifically of opportunities in the context of cooperation around green tech, renewable energy, and other dimensions of this partnership under the Rihla initiative.
Thank you very much, Alex. Yes, as you mentioned, we really wanted to move beyond just looking at renewable energy and particularly solar and wind, because that's really at the heart of all of the Gulf investments, let's say, around the world. But we wanted to move beyond that in the sense of the future of these investments. As I mentioned in the introductions, we're looking at 6 focus groups. So we have green industrialization, sustainable agriculture, blue economy, green urban development, and we're looking at thematic focus on competition and cooperation with China. It was fitting that in the previous session we had multiple on the Chinese, and that's something that we really wanted to look at, particularly within the Gulf cooperation with some Chinese organizations. For example, in our Central Asia policy group that we were having discussions on, nothing by the GCC is actually moving forward without collaboration with China. So it's very important to look at that angle, but I'm also sure that it's the same in the other 3 regions of our focus as well. So these sectors, particularly within the context of industrialization and agriculture, there are 2 different sectors, but there are many commonalities in them within the context of Gulf climate financing, both in terms of the actual funds that are being deployed, but also in the form of their engagements with, let's say, local players or regional players. But when we look at the South African experience, let's say, and the success stories that we're considering for our work, uh, the primary, let's say, reason for its success has been the relatively better regulatory clarity that exists within the context of foreign investments. And that has allowed the Gulf states, particularly Gulf-backed companies like Mastar and Aqua Power, to really set foot in South Africa in a way that they themselves are becoming the hubs within the region itself. And when we look at uh, Aqua Power, for example, Aqua Power took over an American company that was in South Africa a few years ago, and it's also aligned with the work of the Rihla initiative in the context of the past year of with the USAID withdrawals and the decrease in commitments by European players as well. That the Gulf is really trying to position itself as a leader within this context of climate financing. And what Aqua Power did is again within the context of solar, but there are the Infinity company that was basically mentioned in the previous session, and we had a representative from them joining us. It's important to look at it because it's actually a joint venture between Egypt's Infinity and Abu Dhabi's Masdar, which is the Abu Dhabi Future Energy Company, to target power generation and distribution projects in renewable energy space across Africa. But it's not really just on solar and wind. There are many projects. There are 9 solar projects in development now and 8 battery storage projects as well. But they're also looking at green hydrogen, which is something that the region is really trying to, as a whole, as a continent, really move forward towards. Particularly when you look at the context of Gulf interest, because the GCC players, particularly Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, are really let's say, adamant in pursuing green hydrogen. And that's something that when we're looking at partnerships, global partnerships for these companies, for these countries, it's important that they would also want to be aligned with those objectives by the GCC states. So providing this venue is something that is really contributing to the success of South Africa.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Cynthia, this idea of South Africa as a continental leader, but also as a gateway, that investments in South Africa will necessarily hold benefits for the rest of the continent. This is a contested idea. South Africa is no longer the biggest economy on the continent. There's a lot of contestation around national interests versus regional priorities, as was reflected a bit in our discussions in the first panel. What are your thoughts on this? Can you sell us on the idea of South Africa as a gateway for partnership in this area of energy and climate action?
Thanks for bringing me. Am I audible? Good now. Thanks for bringing me in, Alex. Good afternoon, morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Thanks. I think I'm one person who was quite relieved when I heard that the ambassador was not here, not because I had anything malicious to say, but I did want to say something that was a little politically concerning. And I'll share with you before I go into the response to my question, the story about the German student or Gulf country student who goes to Germany. I think a couple of people might have known or heard about it before. So essentially a child from a Gulf country, it's an anecdote, goes to study in Germany, which is for most people quite conservative for those who've experienced Germany, and sends a note to the dad back home and says, I am embarrassed because I drive all the fancy cars and my lecturers here are using the train. So the father responds and says, okay, I will buy you a train. I say that to say the Gulf countries have become a target for financing and funding for majority of the institutions, the African Union included, which is an institution that I was affiliated with. And it's really important that SAIA as a G20 partner and also the Rihla initiative bring us into the space where we discuss expectations and also responsibilities when it comes to engaging amongst countries, and also doing away with that perception that you actually just go to the Gulf countries for funding, but what meaningful engagements and interactions can we have in terms of advancing the energy space, and also just conversations around responding to climate change, which affects majority of the African countries that have got low adaptive capacities. Now, to come back to the question around South Africa as a gateway for partnering with the African continent. As you rightfully said, it is a very contested space. Reason being, South Africa, yes, might not still be the greatest economy on the African continent, but still plays a pivotal role, particularly in terms of its membership within key and strategic institutions. An example being the G20, now G20 plus, supported by the African Union, but also South Africa being a part of BRICS plus, among other initiatives. What we also find in terms of South Africa's participation or even contribution to policy discussions on the global fora, an example would be South Africa's case against Israel at the ICJ. I think regardless of which side of the conflict, genocide, if you will, some of you might align with, the fact that an African nation did go to the ICJ to contest against Israel when majority of the big countries in the world were watching, I think did put in a point for South Africa to really exert the extent to which its sovereignty can be exercised, regardless of what the output was. So that's a position we find ourselves. But also, in addition to that, there are contestations around local politics in South Africa nationally. For example, if you look at South Africa's foreign policy during Thabo Mbeki's time, if you look at South Africa's foreign policy during Kgalema Mohlante's time, and then if you look at South Africa's foreign policy during Cyril Ramaphosa's time, there aren't as many points of consistency when it comes to actually policy following of what a state is, rather than the sort of position or direction that the leader or president is taking. During Ramaphosa's time, there's been an increase in terms of South Africa's engagement with the Gulf countries. For example, in the previous year alone, there was a surge between South Africa and Saudi's exports from 6.6 billion exports up to 7.3 in the previous year alone. And that's a significant increase in terms of engagements. But this is also a period we see the expansion of BRICS to include even more MENA region countries. So we have Egypt coming into play. We also have other countries being invited, including Saudi, to join BRICS. And a part of that is attributed to South Africa's role in terms of championing for inclusivity and more representation. So it's almost as though it plays a double role, where on the one end, there is expansion of conversations around inclusivity and really taking the role of South Africa playing a significant vanguard of promoting human rights and in cases where international law is flouted. But also internally or back home, there's also contestations or increasing dissatisfactions in terms of governance and leadership of an ANC-led South Africa, and that was reflected in part by some of the results that we saw where the ANC lost its dominance. So it's almost like a double-sided coin, where on the one end, I think there is championing in terms of the international agenda or even the regional issues, including representation of African states within the UN Security Council. South Africa has increasingly spoken about that. But also back home, there's increasing inequalities. There's also dissatisfactions in terms of governance. And those are kind of mixed approaches when it comes to South Africa's foreign policy, if it is being followed, but also in terms of South Africa's engagement overall. I'll leave it at that for now.
The microphones are posing a challenge. Thank you very much for those remarks. And maybe just as a rejoinder there, you mentioned South African foreign policy and how that has shifted, I would also reflect that, you know, we are now sitting with the government of national unity. And what struck me is that in terms of foreign policy specifically, that there's been a remarkable degree of continuity between the ANC-led administration and the current government of national unity. And I think that's very interesting to reflect on in terms of these contestation that you describe at the local level as well. I'm going to go over to my colleague Kirsten. Kirsten, you've had a particular insight and lens into the evolution of South Africa's energy policy. We've heard reference to some of the successes in the first panel, the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producers Procurement Program, a lot of P's there. We also have the Just Energy Transition Framework, the partnership itself, and the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, which presents that framework, highlights specific sectors, and as I think we've heard, provides a degree of direction and policy certainty. What are some of the lessons, some of the opportunities that one can reflect on when we look at past and current energy programs and initiatives and the overall just energy transition framing within South Africa?
Thanks, Alex. Good morning, everyone. Part of my career background, as Alex knows, is that I worked at the National Treasury at a unit called the Government Technical Advisory Center. And at the time that I was there, my head of unit was instrumental in working with the Department of Energy to set up that Renewable Energy Independent Power Producers Program. So it's quite exciting for me to perceive the maturing REAP program as providing an opportunity for Gulf financing to come into the mix and for some of these excellent projects to be introduced and playing out in our landscape. So I think that is one of the features that we have heard has made South Africa a good entry point for Gulf financing. But you were mentioning earlier that we have our challenges, and so South Africa is very transparent about our challenges. We'll admit them. So when you come and invest here, you can know for sure it's not hidden. So we forget to reflect on the fact that we are one of the most industrialized economies, and we also have deep financial markets. And these are factors that make us a natural gateway because we also cooperate with our neighboring countries in the Southern African power pool. And so we play a role when there's energy projects that come on stream here, they benefit neighboring countries. And when projects come on stream there, they simultaneously benefit us. So yes, I want to speak a little bit more specifically about some of the Gulf projects that have come through the REAP project. So we've mentioned Aqua Power, and one of those projects that's a new one, there've been previous projects, is Project DOA, and it's a $800 million hybrid renewable power plant in the Northern Cape. So that's going to be coming online in 2026, and it will be the country's largest solar photovoltaic installation at a 442 megawatt capacity, coupled with 1,200 megawatt hours of battery storage. So this is quite exciting for us because the project is injecting energy into a strained grid. One of the challenges is that we have had load shedding, and those rolling blackouts have constrained our economy. So the renewable energy projects are have a knock-on benefit that we can actually do beneficiation, because previously our high energy intensive users were being asked to constrain what they were doing and pull back in their operations, and that restrains growth. Now we can have more energy and we can actually realize the benefits of beneficiating the critical minerals. So some of the Gulf projects are also in beneficiation, improving refineries and so on. So that's quite exciting. And then another of the project is the Qatar Investment Authority, partnering with Enel Green Power South Africa to supply 330 megawatts of wind power through long-term power purchase agreements with Sasol and Air Liquide. And one of the maturing strains on the REAP program is that initially we were able to bring on these renewable energy projects because there was space on the transmission grid. But now we're reaching a point where in the latest rounds, we haven't actually been able to have wind power projects. So there's been some regulatory change, which Eskom is not wildly excited about. They're squaring up in court with NERSA about, where the industrial customers can actually partner directly for their electricity generation. So we're seeing that as a developing kind of dynamic that's playing out. But back to the earlier aqua power project, that one's actually helping us solve some of those transmission grid issues. It'll be supporting an upgrade to a transmission substation and also bringing online a new distribution substation. So the positive aspects of the Gulf financing for us is a nice dynamic that sort of departs from some of the dynamics of development being done to Africa or South Africa. So I think that's something that we value in the country. And to speak about the dynamic of us as a hub, I think the most natural hub has been mentioned. It's into Sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the things that we would want to avoid is sometimes we're accused of being a big brother on the continent, particularly in the past in our role in the AU. We've been challenged on that. So I think we would want to play that role as a hub, mindful of that. And our experiences with country platforms are something that is emerging. We announced a country platform with the Just Energy Transition Partnership at COP26. And the country platforms are proving to be a mechanism where you can figure out how to stack the finance. So when the country determines what its financing needs are, what its plans are, what regulatory and policy changes it needs to make, it's actually very positive for investors because we're doing our own homework. So this is a model that we're sharing, beginning to share with other countries in Africa and also the Global South. And I think it plays a role of acknowledging the country-led aspect of what we find important. So not this kind of impositional role of a state top-down, but also a bottom-up. So in our Just Transition Partnership, the Presidential Climate Commission has been at pains to do a lot of engagement with communities and also with activists, and they're very open to critique in how they've operated. And I think that's a model that they're trying to share with other countries. And I'll stop there because those are some of the experiences which I think South Africa can share in our knowledge exchange like the one that we have right here.
Wonderful, fantastic, thank you. I think for the rest of the questions, I'm going to keep it fairly open-ended. I'm inviting the panelists to jump in as they see fit. I wanted to touch on a theme that has come up prominently in the South African G20 presidency, and that's the cost of capital. We know continentally debt is an issue, cost of capital is an issue, and the cost of capital, of course, is very directly tied to risk assessments. And I think there's a very important debate happening on the continent and globally now around a deeper understanding of risk. This applies to South Africa, but of course continentally as well. And a discussion around to what extent that risk is real, concrete, observable on the continent, and how much of that is tied to biases, perceptions, lack of information, perhaps the move towards an African credit ratings agency. So when we think about Gulf cooperation, potentially, maybe, there's a somewhat higher risk appetite. But at the end of the day, cost of capital matters and risk assessments matter. And I would invite the panel to reflect on the degree to which this is a challenge, where there may be some opportunities to address these challenges in the context of cooperation and the activities happening on the continent in this area.
All right. Thanks again, Alex. I think on the cost of capital, I think it's important to also mention the APRM, the African Peer Review Mechanism, which is one of SAIA's partners, is also advancing conversations around African member states establishing their own credit rating agencies based off of some of the sort of injustices or even inequalities that you find within the international system. Case in point, for example, was South Africa's downgrading during the COVID-19 pandemic by Moody's. So that a precursor to that is the general, I think, discontentment around Africa's representation within global institutions and how risk is viewed on the African continent. South Africa's case, when it comes, and the point I want to bring was South Africa's case, even though in terms of market share or being a leading economy on the African continent might have decreased, I think if you look back to about 2013, 2014, South Africa was one of the few countries that was able to issue green bonds or sustainable finance, but sustainable financing for green development, which is called green bonds. And that was in the city of Joburg during Park Stow's time. So you find those complementarities between sort of a sophisticated market on which South Africa operates in or with, which to an extent makes still the country more attractive for investment, regardless of societal concerns or issues around xenophobia, for instance, which is public violence, but also increasing cases of corruption and so forth. So that makes the country a really sort of admired investment destination on the African continent still. In terms of credit rating agencies and just establishing African-led institutions, a bigger part of it has to do with capacities or capabilities within the public sector. Going back to issues around green bonds, in 2016, I think about 93 trillion of green bonds were issued, which is around 0.13% of the total bond market. When you move that to about 2022 rather, this shifted to about 57% of sustainable bond issuances that were actually green bonds, in South Africa taking a significant lead in that. However, while South Africa was taking a lead, only a fraction of government within the emerging market economies, about 23% of the green bonds were public sector participation green bonds, which means the leading actor within green bond issuances are still largely the private sector. And that's reflective of the governance capacities and the governance institutions that are not able to play at par with some of the private institutions or private companies that we find in different African markets. So finally, the final point would be on, in terms of establishing credit rating agencies, it has to match the institutions and policies at national or even regional level. So having actors like SADC coming in to say, this is Southern Africa's position when it comes to green financing, and that is implemented. Otherwise, you will still have solutions such as green bonds being implemented, but still championed by the very private sector that where concerns around sort of capitalist interests and lack of public interest is argued to be the case. And then the final point is while in South Africa, the sort of challenges are quite diverse. On the broader African context, there are issues around conflict, for example, in Sudan, which is currently at war, and it's ravaged by civil war. And this is one of the largest oil producing companies. So that still poses risk in terms of investment. If you look at countries like Somalia within the Gulf of Aden, there's piracy, which makes it very challenging and very expensive to trade along that Somali route. If you look at the DRC, for example, with its conflict with resource contestations between the DRC and Rwanda, it again makes it difficult or even more expensive to conduct business. But other than that, it actually retrogresses initiatives towards resource beneficiation. So the security situation for majority of the African countries, especially the ones that are resource endowed, and particularly within the Sahel region, bring in Liberia, bring in countries within the Central Africa region, the cost of doing business is actually quite high in those specific countries, and Mozambique to wrap up as well with the insurgency in Cabo Delgado. So there is a relationship between available resources and some of the conflicts that we see, and how do we get governance to work in terms of mitigating the impacts of those conflicts to ensure that business is done in a way that benefits our societies and our countries overall.
Yes, I mean, I've certainly been struck by that discussion around how risk is perceived on the continent, and I think a very important discussion being had around the perception, the bias angle of it. Some people would say, no one's saying because of the war in Ukraine that no one should invest in Europe anymore. But so often we see on the continent that you have a conflict emerge and the entire sub-region suffers in terms of its risk perception. So I think the need for a nuanced exploration of that, because data availability does play a factor, bias does play a factor, but we've got to be able to have that conversation at the same time that we recognize that there are real risks on the continent that need to be addressed, and we need to be able to have both those discussions simultaneously. I don't know if there's anyone else on the panel who might want to reflect on that.
So here I think that the role of hosting the G20 gives us a particular window this year, and also being as though the AU has joined the G20 in 2023, it's quite a unique moment wherein South Africa has put forth priorities that are African priorities and is ensuring that the AU is integrated into the meetings and the spaces of discussion. And so one of the areas that the G20 working groups are looking at this year is this data issue that you mentioned, where we will have our credit rating agency in some time, but right now we're still getting those risky assessments. And so the one effort is a very technical one, which is to improve the data availability to the credit rating agencies via the banks. So the banks playing a role in providing insight into the country dynamics and so on, so that the credit rating agencies have a better set of data that they can establish their credit ratings on. And then at the Finance and Comment Summit, I saw a panel discussion where they actually had two of the big credit rating agencies, and the participants there were discussing how they've started to take on board these feedbacks about the perception now forms these credit ratings, and that the public utility and other entities' credit rating can't be higher than the country rating is another dynamic that really plays out and affects us. So there was a realization of that in the discussion, and the credit rating agency said they're looking at working on their models and actually changing them a bit.
Thank you. I'll take the question a different way. So basically, I'll look at it from the investor point of view. So for the Gulf states, particularly when you look at the Sub-Saharan Africa context, but also the Middle East and elsewhere, there's risk everywhere. What they are trying to do with, particularly with Mastar, Mubadala, Aqua Power, and Taga, other companies that are involved in this, is to trying to prioritize countries based on risk factors that they perceive, let's say. And for them, obviously, there are target countries within each of the four regions that we're looking at, but that doesn't really mean that they will prioritize investments in that country at the expense of others. Obviously, when there are opportunities presented, there are ways to really go about them in a way that the investment itself will contribute to de-risking. And for example, the South African context of the Aqua Power taking over of the American company it was in 2021. One of the main things that contributed to that was the project gaining climate bond certification, for example. And that's a route for de-risking investment, at least in the eyes of the Gulf states, in terms of having these certifications, having a regulatory framework that allows them to maneuver, at least not freely, but somewhat freely, in the context of really pushing the investments forward in a way that would contribute to growing those investments elsewhere in the region in its proximity as well. And another thing to consider, particularly also with regards to Sub-Saharan Africa, and when you want to even compare it with the European approach or the American approach to the Gulf approach, is the proximity also. So for Africa is right next to the Gulf, and for example, for Saudi Arabia, it's a priority region, even more so than the broader Middle East itself. So these are themselves considerations that allow for looking at risks in a different way.
Thank you very much. I do want to go on to questions from the audience. So for those in the room, please do indicate, and then I would ask my colleague to check for questions from the online audience. And while we will have the mic in the audience, I would also ask my colleague, is he still in the room? Adrian? Has he stepped out for a second? Okay. Well, I see some questions in the room, so let's go to those.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. I think this is not on, right? Okay, that's fine. I think thanks so much for the session. It's always good to delve in deeper into the finance issues. I think mine is for Kirsten to then comment on the JP, the country platform, and that big brother comment that she made. And I'm speaking from a very practical logic that have been shared in some COP spaces where there was a big argument when the JP was set up that how can South Africa be a country platform when our energy systems are so intertwined with the rest of Southern Africa? You then end up with a situation where most of that transition financing is going to South Africa, leaving out other regions that might have similar situations. Let's say Mpumalanga is very similar to Western Zimbabwe, being coal producing regions. But the financing, because it was so focused on a country platform rather than an energy system platform, ends up in one particular area. So is there a way of maybe developing the JP from what you think to make it think beyond being a country platform, or is there ways where it's still a country platform but other countries can piggyback on their platform, for example?
Great. I think I saw, yes, a hand in the back. Just have someone assist with a mic.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Tabisom Tim. I wanted to find out in terms of ESCOM. For example, ESCOM is huge or a key player in the energy sector of our country. So I wanted to find out what are the discussions that are taking place currently in order to ensure that there is a just energy transition that takes place in a manner that is effective and in a manner in which ends up developing the communities that are around the country. And secondly, in terms of the current Premier of Gauteng, Panyaza Lesufi, he has been talking more about smart cities. And if you can look at smart cities require green development projects all the time. So my question is, Are you aware of any discussions that are taking place in the country, and as well as if you can look at the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, the Gulf Stream? How is the conversations at the moment currently in order to ensure that maybe Gauteng can produce smart cities that it says it needs at the end of the day? Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Just in case we don't get to a second round, I do want to bring in two questions we've received from the audience. The first one, South Africa has long implemented initiatives such as DIE programs and board memberships, workforce policies, which share similarities with localization programs like Emiratization in the UAE, Sudization in the Saudi Arabia. How are GCC countries preparing to navigate the complex legal and regulatory frameworks surrounding local employment while promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in their organizations? It was quite long, so I'll give you a moment to just reflect on that, maybe make a note or two. Question 2 is also quite long. South Africa, as a mineral export dependent nation, is actively diversifying its economy beyond extractive industries into sectors like technology, waste management, and entrepreneurship. How are GCC countries positioning themselves to avoid over-reliance on resource-rich sectors and encourage investments in emerging industries and startups to ensure sustainable long-term economic growth? Thank you to our audience, online audience, for very well articulated and thought-provoking questions. Okay, so we have a series of questions there. And I did want to also hand over to Adrian Joseph, my colleague at SIRE. He is a African Green Minerals Fellow. We've been working with the African Union on an initiative called the African Green Minerals Observatory. So I think he also brings a unique perspective to some of these questions, both on a continental and South African perspective. So if you want to pose a question, you're welcome to, but I also invite you to reflect a little bit from your own research.
Maybe I can take that last question, Alex.
I don't think that one's working. Let's try again. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I can take the last question that was posed from the online. I think, and it's been mentioned in previous panels as well, I think for mineral-rich countries such as South Africa, given the existing geopolitics around critical minerals, I think it's in our interest to adopt a stance of sort of strategic neutrality. I hesitate to say non-alignment, but what I mean by that is that we should be working with the partners that give us the best deal in terms of developing critical mineral projects that align with our development ambitions, not the development ambitions of others. And I think this is particularly the case given the fact that block dynamics around critical minerals are already developing. You have a mineral security partnership. The G7 is quite clear on what it seeks to get out of critical minerals. So I think for us to avoid sort of becoming entangled in the sort of growing resource nationalism, both in developing countries, but also in developed countries around critical minerals, I think it's important for us to adopt the stance of sort of neutrality and then judging each deal or agreement on its merits and working with the partners that give us the best deals. I think from our side, or from an African perspective, I think it's really important that we have a strategy, a clear plan that signals to investors that we know that South Africa has certain comparative advantages when it comes to the extraction of critical minerals, but we're also cognizant of the various challenges that we face that hinder our ability to become a regional investment hub. So things like our erratic power supply, policy instability, all these kinds of questions, right? So I think from the South African perspective, if we wish to sort of take advantage of if we want to exploit our comparative advantage, then we need to come to our part of the agreement and address these structural impediments that make it difficult for countries such as the UAE to invest in South Africa's mineral sector. I think coming from the other perspective, from the perspective of the UAE, I think it's fair to say that many African countries are being courted by multiple partners who are looking to extract critical minerals in Africa. And so I think the challenge for countries such as the UAE is to say, what is their particular value proposition? European Union has a value proposition, the United States has a value proposition, the Chinese have a value proposition, and so on. And it's about distinguishing yourself from other partners and players. So I think there's homework that needs to be done about what is that strategic value proposition that is offered. I think also we then have to be very pragmatic about minerals diplomacy, in the sense that we have to recognize that producing countries, those that produce critical minerals, and consuming countries, those that need them for their industries, actually have aims and objectives that are not necessarily consistent with one another. One, the buyers want minerals, stable supplies of minerals at fair prices. The producers want greater value addition and greater value for their minerals. So those two things are actually opposed in a way. And so I think for minerals cooperation to be successful, there has to be a willingness on the side of both parties to make certain compromises such as to enable mutually beneficial cooperation on critical minerals. Thank you.
Fantastic. So, hello. I'll go back to the panel. So just as a reminder, the first question is about potential in the context of the JETP for those benefits to be more shared. And I think the sense that South Africa is in that context has been too focused on its own national interests at the expense of the region. The question about the role of Eskom and dynamics at Eskom in the broader debate and contestation that is happening around the just energy transition. Tied to that, a very important point around the role of smart cities and the role of, I think, cities and other subnational actors in general within within this debate. And then our two online questions around localization policies, essentially, and secondly around expanding cooperation beyond resource-intensive sectors. This will be the last opportunity for the panelists as well. So if there are any closing thoughts that you want to contribute that's not covered by those questions, please feel free to do so.
So Kuda has me thinking on the spot about country platforms. And I think we're seeing country platforms at their very early stage, but they're also spreading rapidly in their appeal. So we are lucky enough as SAIA to be embarking on a knowledge partnership around country platforms. And what I've seen so far from some of the knowledge sharing sessions we've attended with other country officials is that the country platform has been adapted for different purposes. So in Egypt, the country platform is being used not only for renewable energy, but also for water and other infrastructure. And so I think that there is potential for our neighbors to also embark on country platforms, and that we can have meetings and knowledge sharing where we exchange our experiences. I think it's important as country platforms evolve that we don't just embrace them without actually critiquing them. So that's partly our role as well, is to find out what their shortcomings are. And like you've mentioned, they do have shortcomings. So they do center the country. And maybe it's important for a country to get its ducks in a row so it can speak to the neighbors. And so, yeah, I think as they evolve and mature, there is definitely opportunity there. And then coming to Eskom, oh, where do we start? Our behemoth. So Eskom actually recently went to Parliament and they launched their new JET plan. So Eskom itself has a just energy transition plan, and it is aware that their plan must fit into the bigger plan. So they came to present that, and one of the facets of that plan, as Eskom has to unbundle, is to create an Eskom green, so that Eskom isn't left out of the renewable energy opportunity. But Eskom currently has a financial constraint, which is that it took on big loans for Medupi and Kusile coal-fired plants, and it kept coming to the treasury for bailouts, and the bailouts were affecting other social spending. It would be at the last minute, and the budget had to be reconfigured for Eskom. So Treasury got a little impatient with Eskom doing that repeatedly and took on its debt. But the condition was that Eskom couldn't take more debt. So Eskom has that constraint for at least the next 2 years. And at the same time, it has to undergo an institutional reform where it's going to be split into different entities. And that started happening. So there's a lot going on at once. And I think that's something that we're going to see as a country might be a challenge for us to navigate a simultaneous institutional change, a big opening up of the energy market, what that means for communities, because the model of cross-subsidizing electricity with the municipal finance model where Treasury provides an equitable share to the municipalities to provide free basic electricity is under increasing pressure. So these are things that we need to navigate in a very practical way. The local government finance local government framework is currently being put through public participation in Parliament to reimagine it. And I think that's an important policy debate to participate in. And then smart cities, I think that I am aware of some of the smart cities. I think there might be one in Cosmos City, but I'm not very well tuned into where that's tracking now. It's almost as though it's been smart neighborhoods. So we have our existing cities which are suffering from apartheid spatial form issues, and to introduce the overlay of a very technical, like technological smart city dynamic is a tricky one on that old form of city. So I think the kind of way that we've been grappling with them is to build completely new neighborhoods. And maybe that is the best way we can do that. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Cynthia.
Thanks, Kirsten. I'll come back to the point you mentioned around smart neighborhoods and some of the, apartheid special development that we've seen across Southern Africa. But for me, I think, or across South Africa rather, but for me, I think 4 critical variables come to mind, and 3 actually come before financing, and that is infrastructure and tech development. I think that's important, and the reason that's important is that some of the tech advances then tend to leapfrog some of the governance challenges that we have. For example, in most governance infrastructure hasn't been able to catch up with a lot of technological advancements. And I think therein lies room for more to be done with little to no government interference, bearing in mind that some of the skills required to even interfere or play is still very limited in terms of know-how. Second one is skills development, and that speaks to issues around unemployment and around inequalities that we spoke about earlier, and then policy and regulations, which would then safeguard the financing that would come onto the Sub-Saharan Africa region. I think without these 4 components speaking to each other, we run the risk of finance being continuously pumped into the African continent, into specific countries, but not really translating in terms of actual development or what it is intended to do. And if we look at the Gulf countries, they've invested over $100 billion at the moment, which has been largely financing or largely around the energy sector. But in terms of investment into creating a regulatory framework or policies that should safeguard some of this financing, we're not faring too well. So I think those 4 are my priorities. Another opportunity, again, related to climate bond certification or opportunities for Gulf and African countries collaboration and Sub-Saharan African countries collaboration is also in terms of policy formulation. For example, majority of conversations around climate bond certification, or even what constitutes a green bond, it's more guiding or guidelines that or indicators, including indicators around use of proceeds and sustainability and so forth, but nothing is binding as yet. It's still very much guiding frameworks. So I think therein also lies room or opportunity to actually collaborate and define what climate financing between, for example, the Gulf region and as well as Sub-Saharan Africa looks like, and what would be a binding sort of agreement or binding indicator of that movement, rather than just some of the guidelines that we have. And also that would then provide room for getting into shaping global policy and global agenda around specific demarcators of what climate financing looks like. And then finally, to respond to the question around how will Gulf countries navigate complexities such as unemployment and inequalities, the sad reality is that most of the financing that will come onto the region will actually reflect our national priorities. I, for one, do not think that it's the responsibility of Gulf countries to determine how they bridge unemployment or inequalities in our individual countries if we're not able to articulate that and actually offer it as a value proposition to say, in a South African context, we're grappling with one or two, three social development challenges, and in our partnership, we think these concerns should be accentuated. If that is not the case, there's again another risk of a top-down approach where an investor or external country comes into the country with their own responsibility or with their own expectations or priorities that are not locally presented to them, and that challenges again local ownership of initiatives, local ownership of interventions. So most of the work must actually be done in our countries first before we actually go to speak and present value proposition to our international partners. And we've seen this playing out in partnerships with the EU and partnerships with the Americans. And I think that could also, there's risk that that could happen in terms of partnerships with Gulf countries if there is a national imperative to address some of the critical social development issues. So it must start in-house and presented to our partners as a priority for our policies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll combine some of the questions and answers together. So for the GCC states in the context of their investments, it's important to look at inclusivity, right? But at the same time, that point on localization, if we want to have a just transition, we also have to look at the context within the domestic environment of each of the GCC states themselves. And I don't necessarily think that having that localization efforts within the GCC states is hampering their investments abroad. Rather, it's actually contributing to their own interests and priorities as well. And that's something to take a note of. But when both sides are happy in that context of job creation, let's say, last year, the Aqua Power project here in South Africa created 2,500 jobs for South Africa. So these kinds of projects allow, let's say, both sides to have a win-win approach to them. And to move from that, one of the key points of, again, success for the future of GCC investments in the global south, let's say, but specifically in sub-Saharan Africa, is what was mentioned in the previous session on industrial value chains. And I think that's very important when we look at, again, beyond solar and wind, and because there are so many other sectors to really consider, particularly, again, it was mentioned with hydrogen, but also there's green steel, fertilizers, battery minerals, and whatnot. And for countries in these specific regions to be seen as a hub, they should also act as a hub in the context of really providing the benefits for the other countries within that region as well. So if all of the investments, let's say by the Saudis or by the Emiratis, by the Qataris, are concentrated in South Africa, that will definitely lead to underfunding of projects elsewhere in the region when we are looking at the GCC as the front runners, let's say, on investment. So if other countries are being left out, whether it's because of the regulatory unclarity or whether they don't have a welcoming, let's say, environment for foreign investment. So these projects that do have, let's say, a regional element within the context of the participation of a country like South Africa, I think the onus would be on these countries to be able to expand the benefits of these investments to those other countries in the region as well. And this goes back again to the discussion we had about regional integration or continental integration. So as Kuda mentioned, there's a 12-hour flight from Rabat to Pretoria, let's say, but that doesn't mean that we should really sideline the prospects of a continental integration, whether it's just for renewable energy or value chains or minerals or however you want to consider it. But that doesn't also mean that all 54 countries need to be part of it. So there are routes to go for this. And I think I'm really adamant on really taking forward, at least for the implementation phase, the continental Africa approach rather than dividing it between Middle East and North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. And I would encourage you all to contribute to this topic in the context of this continental integration as well. I'll pause it here.
Wonderful, thanks. Please join me in thanking our panel. You're welcome to stay seated, but I do feel I should just stand up here for a second because as we close, I do just want to say a few short words of thanks to my colleagues, to SAI's events and communications team. They've provided wonderful assistance. I must mention someone specifically, Jordan. We often talk about thanking the people behind the scenes. In this case, Jordan has been behind the scenes and upfront with us on the content side, and really appreciate everything you've done to bring this event together. Of course, again, a special thanks to the Embassy of the UAE who've supported us, and we look forward to where this partnership goes in the future. And then, of course, from my side to Meron and his team for the approach, for the very constructive engagement that we've had thus far. Again, we're very excited on our side to see where this collaboration goes. Meron, do you want to say you're perfectly happy? Well, with that, I would say the event is closed. For our virtual participants, you are unfortunately not invited to lunch, but for those with us here in the room, we are going to have a networking lunch. We will guide you to the location. It's just off to the right as you exit. Thank you again, everyone.